First of all, I would like to thank Nina and my colleagues at the Academia Kantiana for organizing this very nice event. I'm very happy to participate. So I have a long-term interest in the concept of love and the philosophy of love, and I mainly worked on the concept of love in Kant's philosophy previously, and I very recently published a book on this topic, and now I'm sort of broadening my research into other aspects of the philosophy of love, and I've been interested in this possible connection between love and politics, and this is a new topic for me and very much a work in progress. But I've been reading Rawls and Nussbaum recently, and I've been sort of surprised to find that they have relatively rich moral psychological notions of love that they use when they conceptualize questions of justice in the framework of politics, and in this talk I will be focusing on those issues with this Kantian twist, or relying on resources that stem from Kant's philosophy as well. So my basic problem in thinking about these issues for global politics that we have already discussed today, for instance, the mitigation of climate change, or this global poverty, this huge wealth and income inequality that we have in the global world today. I'm sort of trying to ask the question of what kind of moral psychology would be effective in addressing these kinds of problems. So the focus here is on basically moral psychological motivation with respect to these issues, and I'm assuming a framework of political liberalism for asking this question. So I assume a society where people have various kinds of religious views and world views, and what Rawls calls comprehensive doctrines, and I'm interested in the question of what kind of moral psychology could be effective in solving global problems in this kind of framework. So as I already noted, Rawls and Nussbaum have interesting ideas concerning justice. Probably Rawls's theory of justice is the most famous theory of justice, philosophical theory of justice in the 20th century. And they also speak a lot about moral psychological motivation, and interestingly, they frame, Rawls and Nussbaum, that is, they frame these discussions very much in terms of love. So what is common to Rawls and Nussbaum? And Nussbaum basically builds on Rawls and accepts the basics of the Rawlsian framework. They both have a notion that love somehow grounds moral psychology. They also hold that a key to understanding moral psychology is that there is an interplay between the psychologies of individuals and the operation of institutions. So the kind of decisions and policies that institutions have and implement are guided by the moral psychologies of the individuals who participate in the decision-making mechanisms within these institutions. I also have criticisms about their positions. First, Rawls has this notion that love of mankind, this sort of more universal love, is a supererogatory concept. I will discuss this more when we go on. I have a problem with this idea from Rawls, and Nussbaum presents her moral psychology of love very exclusively in terms of love of one's country or patriotism, and she holds that only this so patriotic love can be motivationally effective. So what I'm going to argue is that, firstly, that Rawls and Nussbaum provide a powerful platform for conceptualizing the moral psychological relationship between love for others and justice, but I hold that their moral psychologies of love lack resources for conceptualizing an adequate moral psychological motivation for tackling global problems. On the constructive side, I argue that by critically combining basic insights from Rawls and Nussbaum with certain aspects of Kant's moral theory, it is possible to construct a framework which is better equipped for addressing the issue of motivation with respect to tackling certain important global problems. So this is the argument. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to very briefly explicate the basics of the moral psychologies of love of Rawls and Nussbaum. I'm going to criticize these arguments related mainly to the scope of these moral psychologies, and I want to sketch out a Kantian reworking of this Rawls-Nussbaum framework. I will be using Kant's notions of love of human beings and his notion of friend of human beings. This will be sort of, I will be giving you basically a skeleton of a larger project that I hope to develop more in the future. And like I said, this is, the caveat is that this is very much a work in progress still. I should also note that when I say Kantian, I mean an approach which utilizes certain propositional or argumentative structures drawn from Kant's philosophy, but this doesn't imply that I would be accepting the whole of Kant's philosophy or his moral theory in this Rawlsian sense of a comprehensive doctrine or a full worldview. I'm just assuming what I say later on. Okay, so very briefly, the explication before I get to the argument. So Rawls is very intuitive, and I think most people in philosophy of love accept something like this. Rawls says in the theory of justice, basic notion of love, love clearly has among its main elements the desire to advance the other person's good as this person's rational self-love would require. I think most philosophers of love accept something like this. So this desire to advance the other person's good is essential for understanding the concept of other regarding love. Interestingly, Rawls sketches this sort of three-stage account of how moral development will happen in what Rawls calls well-ordered society. The notion of well-ordered society would be a topic for some Rawls exegesis, what I won't be able to do now, but he has a shifting notion of that. But in the theory of justice, it is a sort of ideal society which is at least relatively just. So there is an ideality to this three-stage account. So Rawls thinks that when the child comes to the world, moral development proceeds in three steps, which Rawls calls morality of authority, morality of association, morality of principles. And these all involve idealized reciprocity mechanisms where love plays a central role. So the first morality that the child develops comes from parental love. So the parents love the child, and the child therefore comes to love the parents. And also with this first rudimentary reciprocity relation of parental love, the child comes to accept the parent figures as authorities, and this rudimentary stage of morality will be dependent on the authority of the parents. When the child leaves the immediate association of the family and goes to school and various other institutions, in the ideal scenario, when the child sees that other people are acting fairly in these associations outside the family, the child develops a sense of trust and fellow feeling towards others who are sort of doing their share fairly in these different kinds of associations. And in the final step, this is sort of looks like a bit like a Platonic ladder of development. In the last sense, the child who is a grown-up abstracts from these moral feelings towards particular individuals and directs this moral feeling to principles, understanding what the notion of justice means, and so on, and comes to have a well-developed sense of justice. Besides this, there is a fourth, we could say a quasi-step, which is Rawls calls love of mankind. But this is not part of the normal moral development of a sense of justice. This is something extra. So Rawls says that the sense of justice is continuous with love of mankind. And now we see the basic structure of the Rawlsian developmental moral psychology. There's parental love in the ground, fellow feeling, sense of justice, and then this extra notion of love of mankind, which in this picture clearly assumes justice and is informed by justice. But this love of mankind is characterized by benevolence that goes beyond moral requirements, not invoking the exemptions which the principles of natural duty and obligation allow. What does this mean? So to understand how this goes beyond, very briefly we'll look at Rawls's natural duty of mutual aid, which is the duty to assist those who are in need or in difficult circumstances. And this way we can draw out the supererogation which is involved in this love of mankind. Quote, for while we have a natural duty to bring about a great good, say, if we can do so relatively easily, we are released from this duty when the cost to ourselves is considerable. So there is the duty to assist those who are in need or in difficult circumstances only if we can do so relatively easily or when the cost to ourselves is not considerable. This is Rawlsian supererogation, the Rawlsian criterion for supererogation. So love of mankind is supererogatory benevolent action when we cannot act relatively easily or when the cost to ourselves is considerable. And for this reason, Rawls holds that love of mankind is not for ordinary persons. This point is omitted by Rawls scholars sometimes, who hold that Rawls has a sort of, that love of mankind is part of the normal development. It's not, Rawls is explicit about this, that it's not for ordinary persons. Of course, this is very lenient. I will make the argument, but it's quite easy to come up with counterexamples to this kind of notion of supererogation. I will return to this. And Nussbaum has been developing this Rawlsian framework even more explicitly in the direction of love. And Nussbaum even has this very thick book, recent book from 2013, which is called Political Emotions, Why Love Matters for Justice, which is all about like trying to develop this notion of political love and what this is. And for Nussbaum, this is patriotic love. That is the essence of this political emotion of love. So basic points from Nussbaum. Nussbaum holds that all of the core emotions that sustain a decent society have their roots in or are forms of love. And by love, Nussbaum means intense attachment to things outside the control of our will. So basic contrast between Rawls and Nussbaum, apparently for Rawls, love is always directed to persons or to a plurality of persons in the case of love of mankind, whereas for Nussbaum, love can also be directed to other things and ideals and representations of the idea of a nation, for instance, or even to the representation of the basic structure of society, for instance, can be the object of love with Nussbaum. And she thinks that the Rawlsian framework is sort of too cool. She says that the principle-dependent emotions envisaged by Rawls, if not complemented and infused by love of this sort of more intense emotional attachment, will lie too near the surface of the mind to do the job he has in mind. So Nussbaum is very much concerned with the problem of motivation. What makes us care about others enough, or what makes us care about justice enough that we will actually do what is needed to bring about justice within the social framework and within the institutions which are relevant for the social framework. How much time do I have? When did I start? Sorry.
About 5:40, so you have about...
I still have 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's plenty. Okay, but then what's been sort of troubling for me is this quite strong emphasis on this patriotism that Nussbaum has, and it's been troubling me. Like, I've been asking the question of, is this really the best possible way to frame motivation if we think of these global problems, the solution of which will clearly require international cooperation and may not be in the interest, at least in the short-term interest of one's country, for instance. But so Nussbaum holds that a decent public culture cannot survive and flourish without the cultivation of love of one's country. This is for her the elemental political emotion. However, Nussbaum also holds that global concern does exist. This is from her previous book, Creating Capabilities. She says that, I argue that the whole world is under a collective obligation to secure the capabilities to all world citizens, even if there is no worldwide political organization. However, then the next book, which addresses the problem of motivation, frames motivation exclusively in terms of altruistic patriotic love. We can also note that in the international sphere for Rawls, there is no notion of international distributive justice at all. There is only this duty of assistance, which is basically giving advice to what Rawls calls burdened societies. Rawls is skeptical about even giving money. So the duty towards the world is stronger in Nussbaum. Rawls has a very minimal conception about this. Okay, a bit more to reflect, to understand what Nussbaum is after with this idea of patriotic love. She holds that the nation is a necessary fulcrum for the leveraging of global concern. Somehow this global concern, as she acknowledges, and I think what is true, we are selfish creatures by nature, and we have this immediacy of concern. We care more about those who are closer to us. That comes to us more naturally, and it is more difficult to us for care about those who are further away from each other, from us. And Nussbaum, in my view, somewhat arbitrarily draws the line to the nation state. But she holds that this nation state is accountable, and that can be the object of this kind of or that can be motivational for a more altruistic kind of love at least within the nation state, perhaps also globally, but that's unclear. And she holds that any successful construction of political emotion must draw on the materials of the history and geography of the nation in question. Further, this is quite strong, it makes no sense to suppose that strong motivation can be generated by art, music, and rhetoric that are a common coin of all nations, a sort of Esperanto of the heart. To summarize this position of Rawls and Nussbaum that I've been putting together, there is, first point, love of humankind doesn't exist or is at best supererogatory. Secondly, love of humankind cannot provide strong or politically relevant motivation. And third, love of one's country is the proper moral psychological way to approach global concern. And my question is this really the best possible way to conceptualize moral psychological motivation if we have to solve international problems such as tax evading schemes of multinational corporations operating in Africa, the refugee crisis, the climate refugees, from the island nations that will drown before the nations that are sort of more on the hillside will be affected at all. Human trafficking, the whole issue of global income and wealth inequality, the issue of distributive justice. Is love of one's country the best way to conceptualize the way, the motivation to solve these problems? And I contend that it's not the best possible way. If we agree that love is required for efficient motivation, accepting the basic notions from Rawls and Nussbaum, then I contend that for solving problems which require concern beyond one's own nation, it would be better to have a concept of love which reaches beyond one's own nation. So I'm not convinced by Nussbaum's point, and that's number 3, and there are arguments against the first points 1 and 2. First, this idea that love of humankind, the Rawlsian notion, is supererogatory. I think I give an example from Peter Unger. This is sort of out of context, but this is a trolley case that Unger uses to argue for a very demanding impartialist utilitarian position. I'm not going to go that route, but so this example, imagine a person whose wealth is very much invested to this one single item, which is a car, an expensive car which they are going to sell when they retire. That car is parked on the railroad track. There's a trolley coming down the railroad track. It's not going to hit the car, but it's going to hit a child on the railroad track. The person who owns the car is at a switch, and they have the option of turning the switch such that the trolley will save the child but will destroy the car and will make their retirement days very much impoverished. So in the Rawlsian case, maybe it would be easy to draw the switch, but certainly the cost would be considerable. So in the Rawlsian notion, this would be a supererogatory situation. There is no duty because the cost is considerable. So I think the Rawlsian notion of supererogatory love of mankind is highly counterintuitive, and these kinds of cases can be brought up against this. I think we can get a better notion with respect to all these points by building on certain argumentative structures in Kant's moral theory. In terms, using Kant's notion of universal love of human beings, which will give us a sort of thin account of a duty of love, including also an affective element. And now I'm going to go to the constructive part of my argument. So, basic justification that Kant gives for this duty of love looks like this. I want everyone else to be benevolent toward me, hence I ought also to be benevolent toward everyone else. This is the basic argument for this duty of love. Now the benevolence, I continue these quotations, now the benevolence present in love for all human beings is indeed the greatest in its extent, but the smallest in its degree. So Kant acknowledges that the motivation in this universal love is thin, but the ground of the duty is there. So this already avoids the Rawlsian supererogation. Further, benevolence is satisfaction in the happiness, well-being of others, but beneficence is the maxim of making others' happiness one's end. And then there's another argument, which is very similar to the first argument, that gives a rational justification for the duty of beneficence. To be beneficent, that is, to promote according to one's means the happiness of others in need without hoping for something in return, is everyone's duty. For everyone who finds himself in need wishes to be helped by others. And I think that this gives a sort of minimal framework with which we can conceptualize love of humankind as a duty of benevolence toward everyone and beneficence toward those in need. So this thin account avoids this, or at least so I argue that it avoids the problem of supererogation. Also, I want to emphasize that the account is thin. I'm not assuming Kant's moral metaphysics. I'm only assuming these argumentative structures with the hope, because this is supposed to be a political proposition, with the hope that this kind of argumentative structure can appeal to anyone who is sensitive to some version of the golden rule, which has these ideal reciprocity conditions always built into it. For instance, this doesn't say anything about duties to God. They can be still, these arguments can still be grounded in a duty to God for a religious believer, for instance. Now, how demanding is this? This is very close to what Martin was talking about, and I won't be able to say about as much about this as Martin did, but Kant clearly allows these partialist considerations to play a part when we think of how we implement these duties. So there is permission to limit one's maxim of duty by another, for instance, love of one's neighbor in general by love of one's parents. So this avoids the kind of strong impartialist cosmopolitanism which Nussbaum does not like, which according to Nussbaum is the position that love towards all humanity trumps particular duties, non-derivative. So she has maybe this straw man account of cosmopolitanism in this later philosophy, but this kind of post-cosmopolitanism Nussbaum rejects, and the Kantian position clearly avoids that. The prescription here is to improve oneself morally, and here the notion of friend of human beings comes into play. So we are supposed to do a little bit more than we did previously, and we are supposed to try to harbor this affective benevolence towards all, acknowledging the equality of all. And I argue that this kind of moral psychological framework can be more appealing when we think about solving global problems than the one provided by Rawls and Nussbaum. Finally, how much time do I have? I still have a few minutes. Few minutes. Okay, that's great. So motivation. Obviously, Kant holds that this love of humankind, which is the greatest in its extent, is the smallest in its degree. As such, it's not clear how the suffering of the furthest away will motivate us. And Nussbaum thinks that only nationalistic representations can motivate. But I think this is an arbitrary stipulation. If we think of, and there is science also behind this. For instance, astronauts who go into space and they see the planet Earth from space, they report that when they see this particular singular planet in this vastness of space, it creates a great sense of awe and care for the planet. And the scientists who study this phenomenon call this the overview effect. And so these astronauts who come back, they can become like environmental activists and peace activists, and they say that somehow they see the fragility of it all. So clearly, if it can motivate astronauts seeing the planet, there is no a priori restriction why it couldn't motivate, why these kind of representations couldn't motivate other people as well. More personal perspective, when I listen to John Lennon's Imagine, and when Lennon sings that imagine all the people sharing all the world, I become highly motivated, and I want to develop these kinds of rational notions of love in this moral psychological sense for this liberal political framework. So these kinds of, and I'm not thinking about like how a true Finn will care about, I'm Finnish, so a true Finn will care about others, or that Great Britain is great because Lennon is from Great Britain. Is clearly a global concern that is being affected by this song. So I think, and I could come up with more examples like this. But I think this is enough to show that artistic and other representations can provide non-nationalistic motivation for globally concerned action in a supranational cultural context. To conclude, so I think that Rawls and Nussbaum offer a powerful framework for conceptualizing demands of justice in terms of political emotions. However, their moral psychology of love lacks, or so I have argued, motivational effectivity when it comes to solving global problems. Building on the insights of Rawls and Nussbaum, I propose that certain argumentative structures in Kant provide a more promising basis for conceptualizing a motivationally effective global love based on duty. And as I contended in the very last bit, it is possible to conceive of non-nationalistic representations which to support global love on an affective level. Thanks.
Wow. People still have energy. Okay, so let's start with Janina.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's actually just a very short comment on your talk, because while listening to you and your approach on love and global politics, I could not but think on Hannah Arendt's notion of the amor mundi, the love of the world.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether that would be something that you also have already thought about, or something that you would think would be worth looking at, because I think her concept of the amor mundi is very much what one could consider as love and global politics.
Okay, thanks. That's really interesting. I've looked at Arendt's conception of love just a little bit, and I don't know enough about her concept of amor mundi. But at least in some places, she holds that love is anti-political. Love is the least of the least political thing that you can imagine, and there, I think, when she speaks about love, she is assuming a framework of this romantic love, even this, so some could say, unhealthy romantic love of merging. This kind of notion of love, and how to square that, this idea, Arendt's idea that love is the most anti-political of emotions. How to square that with this notion of amor mundi? Does she speak of this in any systematic way? I don't know enough about this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just in a nutshell, I think these are actually two sides of the same medal. You know, she differentiates between these two spheres. The private sphere, which is the place for private interaction and friendship and love in the way that you just talked about. That version of love is something that she says in this personal, individual form of love, the world is going up into flames. So that would be this anti-political version of love. But there's the other sphere, the public sphere, and that is the place of politics and the place of true human acting. And that is actually the sphere where the individual subject doesn't matter, because everything that matters is the world. And that is the place for the amor mundi. And she says you were asking if she's systematic in a way. Well, she is absolutely not that in a way systematic. That.
Can I rephrase the question?
Yeah.
Does she speak of amor mundi in terms of love, besides the word amor? Does she use the word love in the context?
Yeah,
of
Liebe zur Welt. Liebe zur Welt.
Okay. And where does she talk about this? I would like to read this more.
Well, she has in the Vita Activa for sure.
Vita Activa, okay.
Vita Activa, and there are some papers. I think. Well, it's absolutely one paper. I don't know if I remember it in English. It's Krise in der Erziehung, the crisis of education. That is a paper where it's about the responsibility of the parents and the teachers for the children, and it is not only the responsibility for the children, but also the responsibility for the world in which we bring our children. Okay. And she says something such as, if we don't love the world enough, then we should not bring our children into this world. And she explicitly uses the frame love of the world, Liebe zur Welt.
Interesting.
Amor mundi. Yeah.
Interesting.
Спасибо большое за доклад. У меня тоже не столько вопрос, сколько комментарий.
Подождите момент.
Okay.
Спасибо большое за доклад. У меня тоже не столько вопрос, сколько комментарий. Если я правильно поняла, вы сейчас являетесь сотрудником Академии Кантиана и, соответственно, много времени будете проводить в России и даже, возможно, начнете читать по-русски. И в связи с этим у меня к вам вот такая вот информация. В Институте философии Российской академии наук подготовлена и выйдет, ну вот буквально в ближайшие месяцы, огромная толстая книга, которая называется «Эманации любви». Я просто рецензент этой книги, поэтому в курсе. И в этой книге будут рассказываться о различных парах философских и их истории любви, либо истории, например, трагедии и любви Мишеля Фуко и так далее. То есть мне кажется, что книга очень любопытная, интересная, она рассматривает и Запад, и Восток, но мне кажется, что она может оказаться полезным в выработке вот того самого концепта любви, который вы ищете. Я-то думаю, что его выработать невозможно, но как вариант, может быть. Вот все.
Thank you very much for. Thank you very much for the comment. The book sounds really interesting. Unfortunately, my Russian is currently not at that kind of level that I could absorb this amount of information in Russian. But I will keep that in mind. Perhaps I will see the book and hopefully one day I will be able to read it.
Okay, Martin.
Great talk. So here's an objection. What if the car is my parents' car and the child is merely a neighbor? Would I then have to, according to how you spelled out latitude, or how Kant does it in 639, right? Would I then have to kill the child because I can give preferential treatment to my parents? So two answers. Either, Kant is counterintuitive, and he says, yeah, I can kill the child because my parents are closer to me. Or he says, well, in a situation like that, where it's the life of a stranger or like the financial security of my parents, I can actually I must actually save the child. But then something else is going on than just the idea of who's closer to me. Then there's a theory of goods in the background that we need to apply beneficence or duty of love. But it's very hard to see how we get such a theory on a Kantian framework that starts with formal duties or with the notion of rationality, not with the notion of goods, where life is more important than financial security or something like that. So I find the whole beneficence in Kant very underdeveloped and very hard to see how you actually get the right results that you want out of it.
Sure. I agree, and I don't have an immediate answer to that.
No one has.
My point was in bringing up the trolley case. My point was merely that Rawls's conception cannot be right. But how to get from there? So what I would probably try. So we would want to say maybe that you're allowed to save your parents. Or your own child in place of the child of someone else, but the monetary well-being of your parents or your own child would not count more than the life of the other child. So we will need some kind of because I'm new to this, but I would be going into the direction of the Nussbaum's capability framework, and then we need some kind of lexical ordering of these capabilities, when we come up with these priority relations with the capabilities, then we can maybe say that okay, the life is the basic capability that will count more than monetary well-being. But you are right. I'm not sure if I would call them goods. This is one question. How are we going to conceptualize? But we need some kind of lexical ordering or priority ranking between goods or capabilities that we want to secure for everyone in order to assess these kinds of cases. But yeah.
Yes. Let me ask a question from a Kantian point of view. Why do you not assume the whole of Kant's so-called metaphysics? Why don't you speak of the Kantian principle of human dignity? I think your quotation of love of the Kantian term of love as a universal feeling has either an egoistic principle, like the golden rule, or it is founded by some other principle, like human dignity. And then the love gets the role of a motivation. But I think the concept of love would never be able to give reason that I should love another person. Maybe I do, but why should I love? Never, you can never explain it. And this is the Kantian critique of the theory of Aristotle, which has a principle of our nature. Of course, we are loving. Not laughing, but loving people. And it would be wonderful if all people would love each other in this sense. But you cannot explain why we should love if we not love ourselves. But the egoism is not sufficient for an ethical theory in the Kantian sense. Therefore, I would argue that you must compare, if you want to argue for the world love.
Sorry, what was the last name?
For the world love,
Right.
in the sense of John Lennon, you must compare or argue against the principle of human dignity.
Why?
Because this is the supreme principle in Kantian ethics. And I repeat my question, why do you not assume this principle? Why not?
For the purposes of this, thanks, that's really interesting. I have several things on my mind now. I try to keep myself coherent. For the purposes of this talk, I wanted to assume as little as possible. It would be a question, what kind of elements I can bring in, what kind of further elements I can bring in from the Kantian framework without compromising the agenda of coming up with moral psychological principles that could be the object of an overlapping consensus. I think human dignity could be brought into this framework, and clearly both Rawls and Nussbaum assume human dignity. However, I don't think that I would be able to bring in, for instance, the postulates which are important for Kant's moral philosophy on the whole, like the postulate of God, even freedom, immortality of the soul. I would remain neutral on those things and not say anything about that. I also think that when we say that, you said that you cannot be commanded to love or something like that, we have to distinguish between an emotion-based love and a reason-based love, even if the emotion-based love would involve rational structures, and even if the reason-based love would incorporate emotive elements. So the cosmopolitan love, in the sense that I was trying to draw out from Kant, is a reason-based love. It is the result of the universalization procedure of self-love.
Yes, of course. And then you have the principle of human dignity. Very easy.
So I don't think that human dignity contradicts in any way
okay.
what I've been talking
But
about.
then you must change the concept of feeling, because it's a priori founded feeling. That's another species of feeling. That
Maybe.
We have a couple more than two, and we're relatively short of time. Let's just take one more question.
How hungry we are.
Hungry.
Some are hungry. There's one vote for hunger. Hungry. Okay. Let me at least invite Thomas to answer the question.
I think I agree with 99.9% of what you said. I really like this.
I think I agreed with 99.9% of what you were saying. I really like the way you set it up. I have only a clarificatory question and which is in part a follow-up upon Jürgen Stolzenberg's remarks, and a positive suggestion, a constructive suggestion, which is not meant as friendly fire or anything of that sort. And the question is, the clarificatory question concerns the issue of the status of claims about the function of love in ethical concerns. Because for instance, the statements by Martha Nussbaum are characteristically ambiguous about what you mean when you say that love sustains, supports, is the basis of, right? It might be causally interpreted, it might be normatively interpreted. Now, from the Kantian point of view, there is one way out, and I just want you to say basically yes or no to that. In the introduction to the groundwork of metaphysics of morals, he says, moral anthropology would be one that explains what subjective conditions help or hinder people in the pursuit of moral activity, or something else.
Yeah.
Help or hinder.
Okay.
And you spoke about, so this is, although it's a moral anthropology, it's an empirical investigation. It talks about motivations, emotions, feelings, and so exactly the kind of stuff that you've been talking about so nicely. But is the status of the claims that love supports, sustains, basically I want to know more about how love can be reason-based in that sense, right? That's the first point. And the positive suggestion is, Kant says, moral anthropology studies both what kind of subjective conditions help people to pursue moral ends, but also what can hinder them. And you've been, in your last section, when you talked about the distance effect, about Imagine by John Lennon, etc., you basically spoke about factors that can help people to develop this cosmopolitan life, and not about the mechanisms that can hinder people to develop that. And I think it would help your project if you did the negative part as well, about which a lot can be said when you think about nationalistic feelings.
Thanks. That's helpful. So very briefly, first to the second point. That's right. I have not developed an account of negative emotions hindering or corresponding to this positive. Nussbaum has extensive discussions about like anger, disgust, these kind of. So she does a lot of that stuff as well. But that's just, I have to raise my hands. I don't have an account currently I don't have an account of negative emotions. To the first point, which was somehow about like how love, you said you want to hear more about how love comes about or something like, what was the first point? I'm sorry.
Whether the claims that you see in Nussbaum, for instance, about that love sustains particular moral attitudes, or supports them. I mean, the easiest Kantian answer would be that is merely a causal claim, and so irrelevant for purely ethical considerations. But on the other side, you could say that this is not merely factual, because it has such emotions can have teleological functions then, which is explained by Kant in terms of helping or hindering people.
Yeah. So I think my aim in this paper is to focus on the sort of motivational aspect of love. I'm also developing, when we think of the status of moral love in Kant, I've been inspired by this recent reading by a guy called Ryan Patrick Hanley, who published a book with CUP last year, and he has this idea that these secular normative conceptions of love are sort of such as Kant's these secularized versions, basically, of Christian love, that they try to come up with justifications for extending self-love to others, and I think if we accept this naturalistic basis for thinking about the world and humanity in general, I think it makes sense to conceptualize also moral love as incorporating elements of self-love. Think of self-benevolence, which is sort of one of our primary emotions, probably rooted in the impulse of self-preservation. So for us to be benevolent towards others, I think this idea assumes that we know what it's like to pursue ends in general, and this we know because we are benevolent towards ourselves. We want things to go well for ourselves. So in this sense, self-love is assumed. What the categorical imperative does is that it creates sort of plausibility conditions for self-love. So the only way that the maxim of self-love is accepted is if benevolence is extended to others as well. This is I think, the structure of Kant's argument in the case of the duty of benevolence. I see Professor Stolzenberg is shaking his head, but that's the way I've been reading it until now.
The principle of self-love can never be a principle for ethical.
No, but the maxim of self, I didn't say that. I said that the maxim of self-love is allowed on the condition of one's being benevolent to others as well.
How are we doing? I think maybe at this point we should stop, or we want to continue? Okay, so maybe the last question.
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. Perhaps I have just missed this place. You have spoken about patriotism. You see, the problem of patriotism is crucial for this country. The people's wisdom say that patriotism is the last place of asylum of the scoundrels.
Right.
Or if the state government or some people raise the question of patriotism, that means that somebody has stolen something. How you define what is patriotism?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm inclined now to appeal to Nussbaum's framework, but because she's who started this, from my perspective. So it would be patriotism would be an intense attachment to the idea or the representational framework, including institutions of one's own nation. Something like this. I mean, I think, you know, you love your flag and what comes under it. And Nussbaum thinks that this kind of love can motivate you to be an altruist within your own country.
So,
and that it supports dignity.
Those who support the state politics is patriots, and those who are not support are not patriots.
No, that's not Nussbaum's position. You can be critical towards your state. You can demand justice within your nation, and that would be an essential element of patriotism for Nussbaum. What I wanted to say is that there are so difficult problems, international problems currently in the world, that it would be better if we had a broader idea of love than just patriotic love. And patriotic love can be also fine, but it would be easier to solve certain problems if we had a broader notion.